April 1945.
Across Germany, the Third Reich was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for time.
Entire divisions were collapsing under relentless Allied pressure. Cities lay buried beneath mountains of rubble, and millions of civilians wandered roads that had become rivers of refugees.
Every bridge that still stood was crowded with horse-drawn carts, exhausted soldiers, and families carrying everything they owned on their backs. Smoke hung over the landscape from dawn until dusk, while the sound of artillery echoed from every direction.
Adolf Hitler remained hidden inside his Berlin bunker, issuing impossible orders to armies that no longer existed. Yet hundreds of miles to the south,
another drama was unfolding, one that would quietly reshape the future of Europe and challenge everything the Allies believed they had come to accomplish. General George S.N.
Patton had become one of the most feared
commanders of the Second World War.
His Third Army had smashed through France after the Normandy breakout, raced across Belgium,
relieved the trapped defenders at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and now surged relentlessly into the heart of Germany.
Patton believed speed was the greatest weapon in modern warfare.
Every hour wasted meant another opportunity for the enemy to reorganize.
His tanks moved so quickly that supply columns often struggled to keep up, while German commanders found themselves constantly surprised by attacks arriving days earlier than expected.
To his soldiers, Patton seemed unstoppable. To his enemies, he was unpredictable, aggressive, and utterly relentless. But as his armored columns crossed into Bavaria, Patton encountered something he had not expected.
Winning the war was proving easier than managing the peace. Entire German towns surrendered without resistance.
White sheets appeared from windows. Church bells rang instead of air raid sirens, and frightened mayors emerged carrying surrender documents.
American soldiers entered communities that still had electricity, functioning water systems, schools, hospitals, and local governments, yet almost overnight, those governments had ceased to exist.
Nazi officials had fled, committed suicide, or attempted to disappear into the civilian population.
Police officers removed their uniforms.
Civil servants burned paperwork. Local administrators insisted they had never supported Hitler. Everyone claimed they had merely followed orders.
Within days, vast regions containing millions of people suddenly had no functioning authority. The Allied plan seemed simple on paper.
Germany would be occupied. The Nazi Party would be dismantled. War criminals would be prosecuted. And democracy would eventually replace dictatorship. But paper plans rarely survived contact with reality.
Patton quickly discovered that removing every individual connected to the Nazi regime created a problem almost impossible to solve. The Nazi Party had not consisted only of fanatical SS officers or high-ranking political leaders. By 1945, millions of ordinary Germans had joined the party, many because membership had become essential for employment or advancement. Teachers, engineers, railway managers, postal workers, judges, doctors, accountants, city administrators, and factory supervisors often carried Nazi Party membership cards.
If every party member was immediately removed, there would be almost no one left to keep society functioning. The deeper Patton's forces advanced, the clearer this dilemma became.
Cities required food distribution.
Railroads had to operate. Bridges needed repairs.
Telephone exchanges had to function. Water treatment plants demanded engineers who understood complicated machinery. Hospitals required administrators capable of organizing supplies. None of these systems could simply pause until ideal democratic replacements appeared.
Millions of civilians depended upon them every single day. American officers suddenly found themselves responsible not only for defeating Germany, but also for governing it. Few had any training in civil administration. Tank commanders understood armored warfare, not municipal finance.
Infantry officers knew how to capture villages, not how to restart sewer systems.
Military police could maintain order temporarily, but they could not organize agricultural harvests or repair damaged electrical grids. Everywhere Patton looked, practical problems demanded immediate solutions rather than ideological purity. At first,
occupation authorities attempted to identify politically reliable Germans who had resisted Nazism. In theory, these anti-Nazi citizens would replace former officials.
In reality, many had spent years imprisoned, executed, driven into exile, or silenced through intimidation. Those who remained often lacked experience running large bureaucracies.
Others simply refused to cooperate, fearing retaliation from neighbors or believing collaboration with occupation forces would damage their credibility. Qualified replacements existed, but nowhere near enough to administer an entire nation devastated by war. Patton's headquarters received daily reports describing worsening conditions.
Food shortages threatened urban populations.
Refugees flooded into Bavaria from territories now occupied by the Soviet army.
Former forced laborers wandered the countryside, searching for transportation home.
Displaced persons camps overflowed with survivors from concentration camps, prisoners of war, and civilians uprooted by years of conflict.
Every problem seemed connected to another.
Restoring transportation improved food deliveries.
Restoring electricity allowed factories to produce equipment. Restoring local governments accelerated reconstruction.
Yet every solution required experienced administrators, many of whom had served under the Nazi state. Patton was a soldier above all else.
He viewed problems through the lens of efficiency rather than ideology.
During the war, he had repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to use whatever resources accomplished the mission fastest. Captured German vehicles were repaired and used if necessary. Enemy fuel became a light fuel.
Bridges built by German engineers carried American tanks the next day.
To Patton, the collapse of Germany presented another logistical challenge.
He believed civilization itself depended upon restoring order immediately, and he had little patience for bureaucratic delays. His opinions were also shaped by years of studying military history.
Patton admired decisive leadership and believed societies descended into chaos when governments lost authority.
He feared disorder almost as much as he feared military defeat. Looking across occupied Germany, he saw not only defeated Nazis, but the possibility of starvation, disease, crime, and political instability. Every day without functioning administration increased those risks. One of the first questions confronting American commanders involved local mayors. In hundreds of towns, the previous mayors had been Nazi party members.
Some were fanatics deeply involved in persecution.
Others had simply managed municipal services while avoiding overt political activity.
Removing every mayor immediately often meant replacing experienced administrators with individuals unfamiliar with budgets, infrastructure, or emergency planning.
Some American officers insisted every former Nazi must be removed regardless of consequences. Others quietly reappointed certain
officials after concluding no practical alternatives existed. Patton increasingly favored the second approach. He instructed subordinate commanders to judge individuals according to competence and behavior rather than relying exclusively upon party membership.
If a railway manager had kept trains running but had not participated in atrocities, perhaps he could continue operating the railway under Allied supervision. If an engineer had maintained water systems throughout the war without evidence of criminal conduct, perhaps dismissing him would create unnecessary hardship for civilians.
Patton believed occupation policy should distinguish between ideological fanatics and technical specialists. This view immediately placed him at odds with many officials responsible for denazification. Their mission was to remove Nazi influence from every level of German society. They feared allowing former party members to retain authority would preserve the structures that had enabled dictatorship in the first place. To them, efficiency could not justify compromising moral principles.
Germany needed a clean break from its past. Even if reconstruction proceeded more slowly, Patton respected military discipline but often disliked political oversight.
Throughout his career, he had clashed with superiors over matters of personality and judgment.
He possessed extraordinary confidence in his own instincts and rarely concealed disagreement. As occupation policies expanded, his impatience with what he viewed as excessive bureaucracy became increasingly obvious.
Reports from his headquarters reflected growing frustration that Washington and Supreme Headquarters seemed disconnected from realities on the ground. Meanwhile, shocking discoveries continued across southern Germany. American forces liberated concentration camps, exposing crimes almost beyond imagination. At Dachau, soldiers encountered thousands of starving prisoners, crematoria, and overwhelming evidence of systematic murder.
Even hardened veterans found themselves horrified by what they witnessed.
These discoveries transformed Allied attitudes toward Germany.
Calls for severe punishment grew louder. Public opinion demanded justice. The distinction between ordinary Germans and committed Nazis became emotionally difficult for many soldiers who had seen the camps firsthand.
Patton himself visited Dachau shortly after its liberation.
Like countless others, he recognized the scale of the atrocities committed there.
Yet even after confronting this evidence, his practical concerns about governing Germany remained unchanged.
He believed those responsible for crimes should face justice without hesitation.
But he also believed millions of Germans who had belonged to the Nazi Party were not identical to SS leaders responsible for genocide.
In his mind, treating every party member as
equally guilty ignored the realities of how totalitarian societies operated. This distinction was deeply
controversial. Membership in the Nazi Party had certainly provided legitimacy to Hitler's regime, and many historians continue debating the degree of responsibility borne by ordinary members.
Some had enthusiastically embraced Nazi ideology.
Others joined for career reasons, social pressure, or simple survival.
Occupation authorities faced the nearly impossible task of separating committed believers from reluctant participants.
Paper records could identify membership, but rarely revealed motivation. Interviews depended upon honesty from individuals desperate to avoid punishment. Patton increasingly doubted that large-scale investigations could reliably distinguish between degrees of guilt.
Instead, he preferred evaluating whether individuals could contribute to stabilizing occupied Germany under American supervision.
His emphasis rested upon immediate functionality rather than retrospective moral judgment. At the same time, another development influenced his thinking.
Relations between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were already beginning to deteriorate. Although Germany had not yet formally surrendered, disagreements over Poland, Eastern Europe, occupation zones, and post-war influence grew sharper each week. Patton observed Soviet military behavior with mounting suspicion.
Reports described widespread looting, harsh treatment of civilians, and aggressive political control in territories liberated by the Red Army. To many Allied officers, these incidents appeared temporary consequences of a brutal war. To Patton, they hinted at something much larger. Long before most political leaders openly discussed a Cold War,
Patton suspected the alliance with Stalin would not last. His private conversations increasingly reflected this belief.
Germany had been the enemy yesterday, but he wondered whether the Soviet Union might become tomorrow's. If that happened, completely dismantling every element of German administration and eventually German military expertise might prove strategically short-sighted.
Although such thoughts remained unofficial and controversial, they quietly influenced how he viewed occupation policy. American intelligence officers were reaching similar conclusions for different reasons.
As Allied forces captured government offices,
military headquarters, and intelligence archives,
they discovered enormous quantities of information concerning the Soviet Union. German intelligence services had spent years studying the Red Army, Soviet industry, transportation networks, and communist organizations across Europe. Much of that knowledge existed only because experienced German officers and analysts had compiled it. Simply dismissing everyone associated with the former regime risked losing information that might soon become strategically valuable. None
of these debates were visible to
ordinary German civilians struggling simply to survive.
They cared less about geopolitical strategy than obtaining bread, coal, medicine, and security. Children scavenged through bombed buildings, searching for firewood. Farmers attempted to plant crops despite shortages of machinery and fertilizer.
Families searched endlessly for missing relatives whose fate remained unknown.
Every functioning railway, every repaired bridge, every reopened hospital represented another step toward survival. Patton believed those steps mattered more than symbolic gestures.
He wanted Germany stabilized quickly, believing prosperity and order would prevent future extremism more effectively than endless punishment.
Critics argued this approach risked allowing former Nazis to regain influence. Supporters countered that starving populations rarely embraced democracy. The disagreement would soon become one of the most bitter political conflicts of the occupation. As the guns finally fell silent in May 1945 and Germany formally surrendered, the world celebrated the end of 6 years of devastating war.
Yet beneath the celebrations, another conflict had already begun, not one fought with tanks or bombers, but with competing visions of justice, security, and the future of Europe. At the center of that struggle stood George S.N. Patton,
convinced he was solving an urgent practical problem, while many around him believed he was making a dangerous moral compromise whose consequences could echo for generations. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended, but the occupation of Germany was only beginning.
The Allied armies that had fought their way across the continent suddenly found themselves responsible for governing nearly 70 million defeated Germans. What had seemed like a straightforward military victory quickly evolved into one of the largest administrative challenges in modern history. Entire cities required rebuilding. Millions of refugees remained homeless.
Food production had collapsed, transportation networks were barely functioning, and almost every government institution had either disappeared or become deeply entangled with the Nazi regime.
Every decision now carried political consequences that stretched far beyond Germany's borders. The United States had entered the occupation with ambitious goals. Germany would never again be allowed to threaten Europe.
The Nazi Party would be destroyed completely.
Military industries would be dismantled, propaganda eliminated, and democratic institutions rebuilt from the ground up. This policy became known as denazification. On paper, the objective appeared simple. Every person connected to the Nazi system would be identified, investigated, and removed from positions of authority. In reality, implementing such a policy across an entire nation proved almost impossible. Investigators soon discovered that Nazi Party membership had become astonishingly widespread. Before the war ended, more than 8 million Germans had officially joined the party. Membership extended far beyond political fanatics. University professors carried party cards.
Hospital directors did as well.
So did judges, engineers, factory managers, teachers, postal officials, police chiefs, railway administrators, accountants, and countless civil servants. Many had joined enthusiastically, believing in Hitler's promises of national revival. Others joined because refusing often meant the end of a career. Some simply wished to avoid attracting unwanted attention.
The result was a society where political affiliation had become deeply intertwined with ordinary professional life. Occupation authorities faced an impossible question.
If every former Nazi Party member were immediately dismissed, who would replace them?
In Patton's occupation zone, the consequences became obvious almost immediately.
Local governments slowed to a crawl because experienced administrators had been suspended.
Courts struggled to process legal cases because judges were under investigation. Schools remained closed because teachers were being screened. Engineers responsible for water systems sat idle while officials debated their political pasts.
Every delay created new hardships for civilians who were already struggling to survive. Patton's staff sent regular reports describing the growing administrative paralysis. Warehouses filled with food could not distribute supplies efficiently because transportation officers lacked experienced managers.
Reconstruction projects stalled while occupation officials searched for politically acceptable replacements.
Even simple decisions required endless paperwork as military governments attempted to verify every individual's wartime history. To many officers working under Patton, the situation seemed absurd.
They had spent months risking their lives defeating Germany, only to discover that victory had created another battle entirely won against bureaucracy. Patton's personality made him particularly impatient with slow administrative processes.
Throughout his military career, he had valued decisive action above almost everything else. His battlefield success came from moving faster than the enemy expected.
Waiting for committees, investigations, or lengthy political reviews conflicted completely with his natural instincts.
Every day spent debating paperwork appeared to him as another day wasted. He also believed many occupation officials underestimated the dangers of instability. Germany remained filled with millions of armed former soldiers returning home. Black markets flourished in devastated cities. Criminal organizations exploited shortages of food and fuel. Communist political groups, encouraged by Soviet successes in Eastern Europe, began expanding their influence in some regions.
Patton feared that prolonged administrative chaos could create fertile ground for new forms of extremism. His solution remained simple, though deeply controversial. Restore competent administration first. Continue investigating war criminals separately.
Distinguish between ideological leaders and ordinary professionals. This practical philosophy increasingly collided with the official policies promoted by General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters. Eisenhower viewed denazification as an essential moral responsibility. The Allied victory would mean little if Germany simply returned to being governed by the same people who had supported Hitler's dictatorship. The occupation had to demonstrate that participation in the Nazi system carried real consequences.
Patton did not openly reject that objective.
Instead, he argued that the policy had become too broad.
In his view, genuine criminals should face immediate punishment. But millions of ordinary Germans should not automatically be treated as enemies simply because they possess party membership cards.
He believed Allied authorities were confusing political labels with individual responsibility behind closed doors.
His opinions became increasingly blunt. He complained that many investigators possessed little understanding of German society. Some officials, he argued, seemed more interested in ideological purity than practical governance. He questioned whether replacing experienced administrators with inexperienced individuals actually served the long-term interests of democracy. Germany, he insisted, could not rebuild itself if every qualified expert remained under suspicion. These private frustrations gradually became public. Patton never possessed much talent for political diplomacy. He often spoke spontaneously, assuming others understood the context behind his remarks. During wartime, this habit had already caused embarrassment on several occasions. Now, in occupied Germany, it would become even more damaging. One conversation in particular would follow him for the rest of his life. While discussing denazification, Patton compared ordinary Nazi Party membership to belonging to a political party in the United States. His point, as he intended it, was that many individuals joined organizations for practical reasons rather than ideological conviction. But the comparison immediately created outrage. Many listeners, especially after the liberation of concentration camps, equating Nazi Party membership with normal democratic politics sounded outrageous. Newspapers seized upon the remarks. Critics accused Patton of minimizing the crimes of the Nazi regime. Supporters argued his comments had been taken out of context. Regardless of his intention, the political damage was severe. The controversy intensified because Patton had already developed a reputation for speaking without restraint. Earlier in the war, he had slapped soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, believing they were avoiding combat. Although he later apologized, the incident remained fresh in many minds. Political leaders increasingly viewed him as an exceptional battlefield commander whose public statements required constant management. Now another controversy threatened the Allied occupation policy itself. Journalists covering Germany noticed that several local officials, removed under denazification, had quietly returned to office within Patton's zone. Reports suggested former Nazi Party members were being retained because they possessed technical expertise. Critics portrayed this as evidence that Patton intended to reverse denazification altogether. The reality proved more complicated. Most individuals Patton, allowed to remain in administrative roles, had not belonged to the SS leadership or participated in major war crimes. Many served as engineers, municipal administrators, financial officials, or infrastructure specialists. They remained under Allied supervision and could still be removed if evidence of criminal activity emerged. Yet politically, such distinctions mattered little. Public opinion increasingly demanded complete separation from Germany's recent past. Inside Washington, senior officials worried that Patton's actions could undermine the credibility of the entire occupation. The American public had spent years hearing about Nazi aggression, racial persecution, and concentration camps. Families had sacrificed sons on battlefields across Europe to defeat Hitler's regime. Newsreels now showed horrifying images from liberated camps. Under these circumstances, any suggestion that former Nazis were returning to positions of authority appeared almost impossible to defend. Politically, Patton seemed remarkably unconcerned by these reactions. His private diary revealed growing frustration with occupation policies. He believed too many decisions were being driven by emotion instead of military necessity. Germany, he argued, remained the industrial heart of Europe. Allowing its economy to collapse further would create instability reaching far beyond its borders. He also became increasingly outspoken regarding another issue that many Allied leaders preferred not to discuss publicly: the Soviet Union. Relations between the Western Allies and Moscow continued deteriorating throughout the summer of 1945. Agreements reached during wartime proved difficult to implement. Eastern European governments increasingly fell under Soviet influence. Reports from Poland, Hungary, Romania, and other occupied territories suggested communist authorities were consolidating power rapidly. Patton watched these developments with growing suspicion. Unlike many political leaders who still hoped cooperation with Stalin remained possible, Patton believed ideological conflict between East and West was becoming inevitable. To him, Germany's defeat had not ended the struggle for Europe. It had merely changed its participants. This belief dramatically influenced how he viewed former German military professionals. Many experienced Wehrmacht officers possessed extensive knowledge of Soviet tactics, geography, logistics, and military organization. For years, they had fought enormous campaigns on the Eastern Front. Their intelligence archives contained detailed information about Red Army units, transportation systems, industrial production,
and command structures. Patton wondered whether discarding all that knowledge made strategic sense. He never suggested restoring Hitler's military machine. Rather, he questioned whether every German officer should automatically become an outcast simply because he had served his country during the war. If conflict with the Soviet Union eventually emerged,
experienced Germans might prove valuable sources of intelligence and administrative expertise. At the time, such ideas sounded almost unimaginable. The United States and the Soviet Union remained official allies. American newspapers celebrated joint victory over Nazi Germany.
Soviet soldiers had suffered staggering casualties defeating Hitler.
Public criticism of Moscow remained relatively limited compared to what would emerge only a few years later. Patton, however,
seemed convinced that political realities were changing far faster than public opinion realized. These conversations with fellow officers increasingly reflected this concern.
He warned that dismantling Germany completely might create a dangerous power vacuum in Central Europe.
If Western occupation policies remained too punitive while Soviet influence continued expanding east of the Elbe River, Germany could become permanently divided between competing ideologies. Ironically,
events would soon unfold in exactly that direction, but in 1945, Patton's views appeared premature, even reckless, within Allied headquarters.
Patience with him began wearing thin.
His military achievements remained unquestioned.
Few commanders had matched the speed and effectiveness of the Third Army.
Yet occupation duty required diplomacy as much as battlefield leadership. Statements acceptable inside a military headquarters could become international headlines once repeated by reporters. Eisenhower faced an increasingly difficult situation. Personally, he respected Patton's combat abilities and long friendship. Politically, however, each new controversy threatened Allied
unity. The decisive moment arrived after Patton once again criticized denazification policies in conversations with journalists. His remarks suggested the occupation authorities were making serious
mistakes by removing so many experienced officials. Although he did not defend Nazi ideology itself, his emphasis upon administrative efficiency overshadowed his condemnation of the regime's crimes. Newspapers across the United States interpreted the comments as sympathy toward former Nazis. Public reaction was swift. Editorials condemned Patton's statements. Politicians questioned whether he remained suitable for occupation command. Families who had lost loved ones during the war struggled to
understand why one of America's most famous
generals appeared willing to work with
members of the very party responsible for the conflict. Patton believed he had been misunderstood. From his perspective, he was discussing governance, not morality.
He considered the debate practical rather than ideological.
Germany required functioning institutions immediately, and those institutions depended upon experienced personnel.
Punish criminals, he argued, but do not destroy the country's ability to govern itself. His critics believed such distinctions ignored the deeper problem.
Dictatorships survive because ordinary professionals choose to cooperate with them.
Allowing those same individuals to resume positions of authority risked teaching future generations that political collaboration carried few lasting consequences. Both
arguments contained elements of truth. History would eventually reveal that many former Nazi Party
members did return to influential positions during West Germany's reconstruction,
particularly as Cold War priorities shifted. At the same time, countless genuine war criminals faced prosecution through the Nuremberg trials and numerous later investigations. The occupation became a constant balancing act between justice, stability, and emerging geopolitical realities. For Patton personally, however,
the political battle was nearing its conclusion. His outspoken criticism had exhausted the patience of senior leaders.
The qualities that made him brilliant on the battlefield, confidence, speed, and refusal to compromise, had become liabilities during peace. Washington no longer wanted occupation policy shaped by a general who consistently challenged official decisions. Within months, George S.N.
Patton would lose command of the Third Army.
Officially, the change appeared administrative.
Unofficially, many understood the real reason.
His battlefield victories had made him a legend, but his views on governing defeated Germany had transformed him into one of the most controversial figures in the American military.
Unbeknownst to almost everyone involved, the policies he had argued for so fiercely would soon begin reappearing under entirely different names, driven not by the memory of Nazi Germany, but by a new and rapidly growing fear of Soviet power. George S.N. Patton left command convinced that history would eventually prove him right. To many of the officers who had served beside him, his removal felt almost inevitable.
The same fearless personality that had driven the Third Army across Europe had become impossible to contain during the occupation.
Patton had never learned the careful language of politics.
He spoke like a battlefield commander, bluntly and often without considering how his words would sound beyond military headquarters.
Yet while his critics celebrated the end of his influence over occupation policy, events unfolding behind closed doors were beginning to move in a direction remarkably similar to the future he had predicted. Only weeks after Germany surrendered, the alliance that had defeated Hitler was already beginning to fracture. At tea conferences between the victorious powers, disagreements emerged over nearly every major issue.
The Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, installing governments loyal to Moscow.
American and British officials grew increasingly
alarmed as democratic political parties disappeared from countries
liberated by the Red Army.
What had once been described as temporary military occupation was beginning to resemble permanent political control. Military intelligence officers noticed another worrying trend. Soviet forces were not simply occupying territory. They were dismantling German factories and transporting entire industrial complexes eastward into the Soviet Union. Railway equipment,
machine tools, laboratories, and manufacturing plants vanished by the thousands.
German scientists disappeared into Soviet custody.
Engineers who had once built aircraft, tanks, and advanced electronics were suddenly working behind the Iron Curtain, inside American intelligence circles.
Priorities changed almost overnight. For 6 years, Nazi Germany had represented the greatest threat facing the United States and its allies.
Now, analysts increasingly concluded that another challenge was emerging far more rapidly than anyone had expected.
The Soviet Union possessed the largest army in Europe. Millions of experienced soldiers remained under arms. Soviet influence stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Balkans, covering territories liberated during the final offensives against Germany. Unlike many politicians, military intelligence officers viewed this development through practical rather than ideological terms. They needed information, and Germany possessed enormous amounts of it throughout the war. German intelligence organizations had devoted extraordinary resources to studying the Soviet Union.
Long before Operation Barbarossa began in 1941, German analysts had collected reports on Soviet industry, transportation systems, military formations, communications networks, and political leadership. During 4 years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, those intelligence files expanded
into one of the largest collections of information ever assembled about the USSR. The problem was that much of this knowledge existed only inside the minds of German officers and intelligence
specialists. Paper documents alone could not explain years of observations,
personal relationships, or operational experience. Understanding Soviet military doctrine required people who had spent years fighting against it.
Identifying weaknesses in Soviet logistics demanded experts familiar with countless battles stretching from Leningrad to the Caucasus. Suddenly, men who only months earlier had worn German uniforms became valuable for entirely different reasons. This shift happened quietly. There were no dramatic public announcements. No newspaper headlines declared that former
enemies were becoming useful. Instead, intelligence officers began interviewing captured German commanders.
Engineers found themselves answering technical questions instead of preparing for prison.
Scientists who had expected years in internment camps discovered that American
officials were interested in their research. The transition reflected
a dramatic change in strategic thinking. The war against Germany had ended. Preparation for the
Cold War had already begun. One of the most
influential figures in this
transformation was Major General Reinhard Gehlen. During the war, Gehlen had directed German military intelligence concerning the Soviet Union. His organization gathered enormous quantities of information about Red Army deployments, supply systems, command structures, and political developments throughout Eastern Europe. As Germany collapsed, Gehlen made a remarkable decision. Instead of allowing his intelligence archives to fall into Soviet hands, he ordered many of the documents
sealed inside waterproof containers and buried in remote locations
within the Austrian Alps. Then he surrendered,
not to Soviet forces but deliberately to the Americans. His calculation proved correct. Rather than treating him solely as an enemy prisoner,
American intelligence officers quickly realized the extraordinary value of what he possessed. Within months, Gehlen and many members of his former intelligence organization were quietly working alongside the United States. Modern audiences.
This decision appears astonishing only weeks earlier.
These same officers had belonged to Hitler's military establishment. Now, they were helping America understand
Its newest rival. Patton never directed the Gehlen organization himself. By the time it expanded into a major intelligence partnership, he was no longer responsible for occupation policy.
Yet the broader principle echoed arguments he had already made during 1945. Experienced Germans,
He had insisted, should not automatically
be discarded simply because they had served the previous regime. Many American officials who had strongly disagreed with Patton during the summer of 1945 gradually found themselves accepting similar conclusions, not because their opinions about Nazism had changed,
but because their fears regarding the Soviet Union had grown much larger.
Another example emerged in the world of science throughout the war.
German researchers had developed advanced rocket technology,
Jet aircraft, submarines, radar systems, chemical engineering, and missile guidance equipment far beyond anything available
elsewhere. American military planners
recognized that allowing Soviet forces to recruit those scientists first could dramatically
alter the post-war balance of power. This concern produced one of the most famous programs of the early Cold War, Operation Paperclip. The project secretly brought hundreds of German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists to the United States,
where many continued their work under American supervision. Some had held Nazi Party memberships, others had contributed directly to
Germany's military industries. Their wartime backgrounds generated enormous ethical controversy, but American officials concluded
that losing their expertise to the Soviet Union
represented an even greater
strategic risk. Among them were rocket engineers, whose work would eventually influence both military missile development and the American space program. Again,
the similarities with Patton's earlier thinking became
difficult to ignore. He had argued that technical competence sometimes outweighed political history when national security was involved. Now, the United States government itself was
quietly adopting exactly that principle in selected
fields. The difference lay in presentation. Officials
rarely described these programs as cooperation with former Nazis. Instead, they emphasized scientific expertise, intelligence value, or anti-communist credentials. Political language changed, strategic objectives remained remarkably similar. Meanwhile,
conditions inside occupied Germany continued evolving. The first wave of denazification
proved far more difficult than planners had anticipated. Millions of questionnaires required examination. Investigators
struggled to verify personal histories. Courts became overwhelmed by
appeals. Many communities simply lacked enough politically acceptable professionals to replace dismissed officials. Gradually,
occupation policy became more selective. Rather than removing everyone connected with the Nazi Party, authorities increasingly focused attention upon
individuals responsible for major crimes or leadership roles. Ordinary party members often returned to professional careers after screening procedures. Teachers resumed teaching, engineers repaired infrastructure, doctors reopened hospitals, municipal administrators once again managed city governments. The change did not happen because Allied leaders suddenly forgave the Nazi regime. It happened because governing an entire country demanded compromises between justice and practicality. Historians continue debating where that balance should have been drawn. Some argue occupation
authorities reintegrated former Nazis far too quickly, allowing many individuals to escape meaningful accountability. Others contend that rebuilding West Germany into a stable democracy required experienced administrators. Regardless of their political past, both perspectives remain subjects of active historical discussion. Patton, however,
never lived long enough to witness how these debates unfolded. His career had effectively ended before the Cold War fully emerged.
Yet his private writings reveal growing certainty that conflict with the Soviet Union represented the future. In conversations with fellow officers, he expressed frustration that Allied governments still viewed Moscow primarily as a partner.
He believed ideology made lasting cooperation impossible. To Patton, communist expansion represented a strategic danger equal to or perhaps even greater than the defeated Nazi state. Many contemporaries considered such opinions extreme during 1945. Within only a few years, they would become central assumptions guiding Western foreign policy. The Cold War transformed countless former enemies into reluctant partners. West Germany itself gradually became one of America's closest allies. Former
Wehrmacht officers helped establish the new Bundeswehr after West Germany regained limited military sovereignty.
intelligence networks originally created against the Soviet Union continued operating under American guidance. Scientists once employed by Hitler's regime contributed to Western technological development. None of these decisions erased the crimes committed by Nazi Germany.
War crime trials continued. Former concentration camp personnel faced prosecution. Leading political and military figures stood before international tribunals in Nuremberg, where evidence of systematic murder shocked the world. Justice remained an essential component of occupation policy. Yet, alongside those highly publicized trials, another quieter process unfolded. Governments selected individuals they believed could serve useful purposes in the emerging geopolitical struggle. Sometimes those choices involved difficult moral compromises. Sometimes they produced lasting controversy. Sometimes they revealed how quickly international priorities could change. Patton's name gradually faded from these discussions. Popular memory remembered him primarily as the aggressive tank commander who raced across France and relieved Bastogne. His occupation policies became overshadowed by his battlefield victories and by the tragic accident that would soon claim his life. Yet historians examining the first years of the Cold War repeatedly encounter questions strikingly similar to those Patton had raised. Can technical expertise justify cooperation with morally compromised individuals?
Should national security outweigh demands for complete justice? How does a victorious nation rebuild a defeated society without relying upon people who once served
the old regime?
These questions possessed no easy answers in 1945. They remain difficult today. The reality proved far more complicated than simple accusations that America recruited Nazis. Some individuals were undoubtedly committed believers who escaped harsher punishment because their knowledge appeared valuable. Others had belonged to the Nazi Party largely because professional survival required membership. Still others had actively opposed Hitler in private while continuing government careers under dictatorship. Occupation officials often struggled to distinguish among them. Every decision involved uncertainty. Every choice carried consequences. Looking back decades later, it becomes clear that the transition from World War II to the Cold War happened far faster than almost anyone expected. The enemy changed. The priorities changed. Even the definitions of useful and dangerous changed. George S.N.
Patton had sensed that transformation earlier than many of his contemporaries, whether one views his conclusions as strategic foresight or dangerous moral compromise, depends largely
upon how one weighs the competing demands of justice, security, and historical necessity.
What cannot be denied is that, by the end of 1945, the United States was already moving toward policies that would have seemed almost unimaginable when Allied soldiers first crossed into Germany.
The war against Nazism had ended, but a new global confrontation was rapidly taking shape, and in that new struggle, the experience, knowledge, and expertise of thousands of former Germans, some of them former Nazi Party members, would become assets that governments on both sides of the iron
curtain were increasingly unwilling to ignore. As 1945 drew to a close, George S.N. Patton found himself in a position that would have been almost unimaginable only months earlier.
The general who had commanded one of the most successful armies in Europe was no longer shaping the occupation of Germany.
Instead, he had been transferred to command the 15th Army, an organization whose primary responsibility was to collect historical records of the war rather than prepare for future operations.
Officially, the assignment was important.
Unofficially, nearly everyone understood it was a dead end. Patton himself certainly did.
A commander who had spent his life leading armored spearheads across battlefields now found himself supervising military historians.
For a man driven by action, it was a punishment more painful than any formal reprimand.
Patton accepted the assignment publicly, but privately his frustration only deepened.
His diary entries and conversations with trusted officers reflected a growing belief that political leaders had failed to understand the new strategic reality emerging across Europe. He remained convinced that the Soviet Union represented the greatest long-term threat to Western civilization.
Germany, in his mind, had already been defeated. Communism, however, was expanding rapidly across Eastern Europe. Every week seemed
to bring another report of Soviet-backed governments tightening their control over newly occupied territories. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was visibly beginning to fracture. Many of Patton's colleagues dismissed these concerns as the opinions of a soldier who could not adjust to peace.
After years of constant warfare, perhaps he simply expected another conflict to begin.
Yet history would soon demonstrate that relations between East and West deteriorated far faster than even optimistic politicians had anticipated. Winston Churchill would deliver his famous Iron Curtain speech less than 6 months after Patton's death.
The Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Airlift, NATO, and the Cold War itself would follow within only a few years. Patton never lived to witness any of it. On December 9, 1945, while traveling near Mannheim, Germany, Patton's staff car collided with a slow-moving American military truck.
Unlike the other occupants of the vehicle, Patton suffered catastrophic injuries when his neck struck the metal frame separating the front and rear seats. The accident occurred at relatively low speed, but the angle of impact fractured his cervical spine, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down.
For nearly 2 weeks, doctors fought to save him. Visitors entered his hospital room expecting to find the energetic general who had once seemed larger than life.
Instead, they encountered a man confined to bed, unable to move his body, fully aware that his military career had ended forever.
Despite moments of optimism, complications continued to worsen.
On December 21, 1945, George Essen, Patton died from a pulmonary embolism caused by his injuries.
He was 60 years old. His death immediately gave rise to speculation over the decades.
Numerous conspiracy theories have claimed Patton was assassinated because of his outspoken criticism of Soviet policy or his controversial opinions regarding occupied Germany. Books, documentaries, and television programs have suggested secret intelligence agencies arranged the accident to silence him before he could influence American foreign policy, despite their popularity. Historians have found no credible evidence supporting these claims. Contemporary investigations concluded that the collision was exactly what it appeared to be, a tragic traffic accident during a period when thousands of military vehicles crowded European roads.
The truck driver survived.
Other passengers survived. Mechanical inspections revealed no indication of sabotage. Medical records consistently supported the official explanation for Patton's death. Yet the persistence of these theories reveals something important about Patton's reputation even after his death. Many people continued viewing him as a commander who saw geopolitical changes before others recognized them. Because his warnings about Soviet intentions later appeared partly justified, some assumed powerful interests must have wanted him silenced.
The historical evidence simply does not support that conclusion. While Patton's life ended in December 1945, the policies he had argued about continued evolving.
During the late 1940s, the occupation of Germany changed dramatically. Initial plans emphasizing strict punishment gradually gave way to reconstruction. The Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. West Germany emerged as one of the central pillars of that effort.
Economic recovery became just as important as political reform. The Cold War accelerated every one of these changes. By 1948, Soviet actions in Eastern Europe and the Berlin blockade convinced American leaders that a prosperous, stable West Germany
represented an essential barrier against communist expansion.
Policies that had seemed unacceptable immediately after the war became increasingly practical as strategic priorities shifted. Former German military officers quietly advised Western planners. Scientists continued working on advanced technologies. Industrial managers returned to major companies. Experienced civil servants once removed during denazification often resumed administrative responsibilities after extensive screening. None of this happened because allied governments forgot the crimes of the Third Reich. Rather, they concluded that rebuilding Western Europe required expertise that could not easily be replaced. At the same time, justice continued through other channels. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted leading political and military figures responsible for planning aggressive war and organizing crimes against humanity. Subsequent trials investigated doctors involved in medical experiments, judges who enforced
racial laws, industrialists who exploited forced labor, concentration camp personnel, Einsatzgruppen and commanders, and many others directly responsible for atrocities. Thousands faced prosecution over the following decades. Many received prison sentences. Some were executed. Others escaped punishment, often because evidence proved insufficient or because investigators simply lacked the resources to examine millions of individual cases. This mixture of justice, compromise, and geopolitical calculation defined much of the post-war period. It also explains why modern discussions about Patton's occupation policies often become so controversial. Some writers portray him as a visionary who understood the Soviet threat before anyone else.
Others describe him as dangerously naive regarding Nazism and too willing to overlook the moral consequences of collaboration. The historical reality lies somewhere between those extremes. Patton never expressed sympathy for Hitler's ideology.
He fought relentlessly to destroy the Third Reich. His armies liberated occupied territory across Europe. He visited concentration camps and acknowledged the horrors committed there. Nothing in his military record suggests support for Nazi racial policies or dictatorship.
What made him controversial was his belief that defeating Germany required one set of policies while governing Germany required another. He believed technical competence should sometimes outweigh political history when immediate stability was at stake.
Many contemporaries found that argument unacceptable in 1945. Ironically, governments across the Western Alliance would later adopt similar approaches, although usually with greater caution and stricter oversight. That does not mean Patton was entirely correct. Historians have documented numerous cases where former Nazis successfully concealed their past and later occupied influential positions in politics, business, intelligence, and industry. Some individuals who benefited from early Cold War priorities
should almost certainly have faced stronger legal consequences. Programs like Operation Paperclip and the Gehlen Organization remain subjects of ethical debate precisely because they involved cooperation with people connected, in varying degrees, to the Nazi state. The question has never been simple: was defeating Soviet expansion important enough to justify employing former enemies? Could valuable scientific knowledge outweigh moral compromise? Should democratic governments ever cooperate with individuals who previously served criminal regimes? There are no universally accepted answers.
Different historians emphasize different priorities. Some argue the Cold War left Western governments with few realistic alternatives. Others contend that strategic necessity became an excuse for abandoning principles established during the Nuremberg trials. Both perspectives continue shaping academic research today. What is undeniable is that the transition from World War II to the Cold War happened with astonishing speed. In May 1945, Germany was the greatest threat the world had ever known. By 1947, American strategic planning focused increasingly on containing Soviet influence.
Within a decade, West Germany had become one of America's closest allies. Former enemies now stood together inside the NATO alliance, preparing to defend Europe against a completely different adversary. That transformation would have seemed almost impossible while the fighting still raged across the Rhine.
Patton sensed that shift earlier than many others. Whether one interprets his conclusions as foresight or as deeply flawed judgment depends upon the lens through which history is viewed. His critics correctly warned that former Nazis should never escape accountability simply because they possessed useful skills.
His supporters correctly observed that rebuilding an entire nation required experienced administrators, engineers, and specialists. History ultimately incorporated elements of both positions. War criminals were prosecuted. Many ordinary party members eventually returned to civilian life.
Technical experts contributed to Western reconstruction. Intelligence officers who once fought for Hitler later worked against Stalin. The moral clarity of wartime gradually gave way to the ambiguities of peace. Perhaps that is the most important
lesson behind Patton's controversial occupation policies.
History rarely divides neatly between heroes and villains once the shooting stops. Winning a war is often simpler than deciding how to build the peace that follows. The destruction of Nazi Germany required overwhelming military force. Rebuilding Europe demanded difficult political choices that satisfied no one completely.
George S.N.
Patton became one of the first senior Allied commanders forced to confront that uncomfortable reality. His opinions cost him his command. His words damaged his reputation, yet many of the practical questions he raised continued shaping Western policy long after his death.
Today, nearly 8 decades later, historians still debate whether those choices were unavoidable necessities or preventable moral failures. Newly declassified documents continue to shed light on intelligence operations, scientific recruitment programs, and the complex process of rebuilding post-war Germany. Each new discovery reinforces a central truth. The end of World War II was not the end of history. It was the beginning of an entirely new geopolitical struggle whose consequences continue influencing international politics to this day. When people hear the title why Patton secretly recruited thousands of former Nazis after Germany surrendered. It naturally suggests a dramatic hidden operation led personally by the famous general. The historical record tells a more nuanced story.
Patton did not secretly enlist thousands of former Nazis into the American army.
Instead, he became one of the earliest and most outspoken advocates for retaining experienced Germans, including
many who had belonged to the Nazi Party in administrative, technical, and security roles because he believed the greater danger now lay to the east. His views placed him at odds with official occupation policy, contributed to his removal from command, and sparked controversies that continue to this day. Ironically, although Patton himself disappeared from the center of events, the strategic
logic behind many of his arguments became increasingly influential as the Cold War intensified. Intelligence networks staffed by former German officers expanded under American oversight. German scientists helped shape the missile and space programs. West Germany evolved from a defeated enemy into a cornerstone of the Western Alliance. None of these developments erased the crimes of the Nazi regime, nor did they resolve the profound ethical questions involved.
Instead, they demonstrated how rapidly national priorities can change when one global conflict gives way to another.
George S.N.
Patton remains remembered as one of the greatest battlefield commanders of the Second World War. Yet one of the most fascinating chapters of his life took place not during the thunder of advancing tanks, but in the uneasy silence that followed Germany's surrender, a moment when the world discovered that winning the peace could be every bit as complicated as winning the war.